Well, it is that time again. 9:15 on a Sunday morning. This Sunday is a little different because normally we do singing and prayer requests, and I begged Rick to let me teach instead, even though it's first Sunday, because I think I taught one lesson last month, which isn't very much. So here we are. We've got handouts coming around. Holler at Malachi if you don't get one, or raise your hand or something if he's already passed you by. We are in Joshua chapter 7 this morning. Last time we were in Joshua, I don't even remember when that was. A long time ago. We looked at the first 10 verses. Actually, chapter 7 and 8 go together. They're kind of a unit having to do with the first attack on Ai, then the story of Achan, which we get today, and then the second attack on Ai. So today's lesson is kind of a sad one in some ways. You're probably familiar with the story of Achan. We learned early on in the first verse of chapter 7 that Achan had sinned. God had specifically told Joshua and the Israelites when they attacked and took Jericho, he said, "Don't take any of the stuff." He did say, "The metal objects you bring to me," and they were to be housed in the tabernacle, but everything else was to be dedicated to God and burned and destroyed. And the narrator tells us in verse 1 that Achan had violated that ban. So in the intervening verses, Joshua sent some guys up to Ai, figured it was a small town, they could take it easily, and they got whooped. And so that was where we left it off last time we were in here. So, well, the place we left it was Joshua on his face before the Lord at the tabernacle, complaining about why weren't we just content to stay back on the other side of the Jordan. You can sense some fear in him. He's afraid that now that they have been beaten by a small group, that the rest of the Canaanites will be encouraged and attack them. So, starting with verse 11, I should start with verse 10. So the Lord said to Joshua, "Rise up. Why is it that you have fallen on your face? Israel has sinned, and they have also transgressed my covenant which I commanded them. And they have taken some of the things under the ban and have stolen and deceived. Moreover, they've also put them among their own things. Therefore, the sons of Israel cannot stand before their enemies. They turn their backs before their enemies, for they have become accursed. I will not be with you anymore unless you destroy the things under the ban from your midst." Does that sound a little bit snippy? To use some modern parlance. God's not happy. He had given very specific directions, and somebody in the camp, known only to God at this point and to themselves, had, I don't even know what word to use, rebelled, violated that. It's an in-your-face kind of action to receive a direct command and then turn right around and be disobedient, which is what Achan had done. And God tells Joshua, until you deal with this, I am not on your side. And God also, well, you notice that, he specifically identified the problem here. It's not a question of what happened really once God starts to speak. He puts his finger right on it. God also gives the solution to this. So again, in verse 13, rise up, consecrate the people, and say, consecrate yourselves for tomorrow. For thus the Lord, the God of Israel, has said, there are things under the ban in your midst, O Israel. You cannot stand before your enemies until they have been removed. Until you have removed the things under the ban from your midst. In the morning, then you shall come near by your tribes. And it shall be that the tribe which the Lord takes by lot shall come near by families. And the family which the Lord takes shall come near by households. And the household which the Lord takes shall come near man by man. And it shall be that the one who is taken with the things under the ban shall be burned with fire, and all that belongs to him, because he has transgressed the covenant of the Lord, and because he has committed a disgraceful thing in Israel. So God says, first off, consecrate yourselves. We don't know exactly what that means. He doesn't give a lot of detail here, but I would kind of assume inspect your own life, make sure that you are pure, don't come before me in a sinful or unclean state. And then God promises to put his finger on, point out who this is that is the offender. And he's going to do it kind of by the process of elimination. I think that's how I would describe that. My New American Standard here inserts the word by lot. The text is kind of vague, just says whoever is taken. And the casting of lots is a way of doing that we see in other places. It's also possible, I think, that the Urim and the Thummim were used by the priest, but there was some form of yes or no way that God could communicate to them. Is it this group, yes or no? Is it this group, yes or no? Is it this group, yes or no? I don't know if, well, things that we would call dice are actually quite ancient. A cube with dots on the sides. I would have guessed some years ago that was sort of maybe a medieval invention or something. But we actually have examples that go way back into the late Bronze and even Middle Bronze ages. They show up in Europe. This display is interesting. You've got a leg bone from a sheep stretched out through the middle there. And then at the back are these little knuckle bones called ostrgali, which they used apparently in a similar way. They would flip them, and depending on which side it landed on, it was kind of like dice. And then in the foreground, you can see some carved pieces that are actually, they're carved out of bone, that are actually have dots on them, like modern day dice. I wouldn't want to play a game of dice with those dice. They don't look to me to be very fair. Not very, very cubical. Some of these are Roman, and some of them are probably earlier. And you can see one ostrgali there as well, down in the lower right-hand corner. Perhaps lots were something like this. We simply don't know. It's about the closest thing we can get to. The text just doesn't tell us how groups were taken here. But he starts with the big picture, actual tribes, and then reduces down to smaller and smaller subunits until we get down to a single person. And then once they have identified the offender, God gives the punishment for his crime, which is to be burned with fire. The punishment is not up to Joshua or to the tribe or to the nation. God has set the punishment even before they have identified who it's to be. Okay, so verse 16 here. Joshua rose early in the morning and brought Israel near by tribes, and the tribe of Judah was taken. That's kind of interesting. He brought the family of Judah near and took the family of the Zerahites. That would be a family group, large group named after Zerah, whoever that is. And he brought the family of the Zerahites near, man by man, and Zavdi was taken. And he brought the household near, man by man, and Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zavdi, the son of Zerah, from the tribe of Judah, was taken. Then Joshua said to Achan, my son, I implore you, give glory to God, give glory to the Lord, the God of Israel, and give praise to him, and tell me now what you have done. Do not hide it from me. So, the plan narrows all of these people from the nation of Israel down to a single guy named Achan. I don't know if you noticed or if you were counting the number of commands that Joshua gave to Achan when he finally fingered him. There's 4 of them. Give glory, give praise, tell me, don't hide it. And I would suggest it's 4 different things, but it's really the same thing. A single command. He wasn't asking Achan, okay, go over to the tabernacle and praise God and sing a song. And no, the way that he was to give God glory was through his confession. Confess what you've done, and that will be glorifying to God. I think that's an interesting thing to think about from a personal perspective, that God is glorified when we do not conceal our sin. Every one of us sins. When we do not conceal it, but when we confess it to him, he's glorified by that. We tend more to focus on our own embarrassment. I don't really want to have to go to God and tell him again, confess what I've done, but you should. It's a good thing to do. Not only does it clear the slate between you and God, but it glorifies him as well. I would take that from this passage here. Okay. Achan's response, starting in verse 20. So Achan answered Joshua and said, truly, I have sinned against the Lord, the God of Israel. This is just what I did. When I saw among the spoil a beautiful mantle from Shinar, 200 shekels of silver, and a bar of gold 50 shekels in weight, then I coveted them and took them. And behold, they are concealed in the earth inside my tent, with all the silver underneath it. So Joshua sent messengers, and they ran to the tent, and behold, it was concealed in his tent, with the silver underneath it. And they took them from inside the tent, and brought them to Joshua and to all the sons of Israel, and they poured them out before the Lord. I'm always kind of curious about these things like clothing and silver and gold. So I've got a couple pictures for you. This one may be a little bit dark, and it's a little bit older than the time of Joshua, but the guy's wearing a pretty fancy robe. If you could see it a little better, it's kind of the artist. There's no color, of course, because it's carved in stone, but he's even shown the little the weave of the cloth and the threads and tassels and stuff. Cloth does not commonly survive from this far back, right? You would understand that. So a couple pictures I'm going to show you here are cloth from this period or even earlier. They're not in real good shape, so you have to use your imagination a little bit. This is some, actually got some color in it from about the time of King Tut, and that's roughly the time of Joshua. Some linen, and then it's got a collar with some gold work on it, finely embroidered. If you would clean that up and iron it out, maybe that's a picture of the kind of thing that Achan saw and coveted. And one more. This is actually a leopard skin. If you look in the upper right-hand corner, you can still see the claws attached from the paw. And it's got little gold stars attached to it all over. And the whole thing is dyed kind of a purpley color. And I thought, well, that's a pretty fancy coat. I know it's in bad shape looking at it here. But you can imagine if that was in good shape, that would be something you might covet, right, if you don't mind wearing leather. So, I believe they're metal, little gold 5-pointed stars. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so is he like pulling up the wagon? And everybody's like, what's Achan doing over there? That's a great question. How much was this? This is just a roughly contemporary example of silver. They didn't have coinage at this time, much less stupid paper money. So they just had odd-shaped things, and the way that they would measure it was by weighing it. That's how you would know. A shekel was not a denomination at this time, it was a weight. 200 shekels is silver. So from other historical records we have an unskilled laborer at this time earned between 1 and 2 shekels a month. So for somebody that was unskilled, this could be 10 to 15 years worth of wages. It's really difficult to try and convert it into dollar amount. There's so many different ways you can try and do that. 50 shekels of gold would have been a chunk weighing about 1.25 pounds. If you just had that as gold bullion today, it'd be worth roughly $35,000. £1.5 pounds. I mean, that would be pretty easy to conceal in a pocket or tuck it in your belt or something. It's not a huge chunk, that he's going to be walking away from Jericho with this thing. It's something you could slip in and hide somewhere. The silver would be a little heavier, of course, but even that, 4 or 5 pounds of silver. In antiquity, this much gold would have been worth a lot more than it is today. Today, gold is relatively cheap to purchase, at least with American dollars at this time. But it represents a significant amount of money, too. This is not pocket change that he has taken. I have no idea what that robe or coat from Shinar would have been worth, but obviously imported and rare and must have looked pretty nice. And so he shook the dust off of it, and who knows how he got it home. Each one of those is would be equivalent of about 100 shekels. So it'd be about a half of one of those bars. Of course, you don't have perspective there to see what size those are, but they're not real big. A pound and a quarter of gold. Gold is super heavy, but it's still not a ton. Okay. So he says, I have taken it to my tent and have hidden it under the floor. And it would have been a dirt floor down there in Gilgal. I think modern Bedouin tents are a pretty decent example. These guys have a rug laid out, and you can see how you could easily dig a hole, bury stuff, put a rug over it. Nobody knows the difference. Except, of course, for the other people living in the tent. And I think we have to conclude that the other people in his household were co-conspirators. They knew what was going on. They probably helped him bury it. They were in on the racket. Okay, so he confesses, he tells them where it is, they find it. God has already pronounced judgment, right? Before this whole thing started, God said, here's what the punishment is going to be. So if we pick up here in verse 24, Joshua and all Israel with him took Achan the son of Zerah, the silver, the mantle, the bar of gold, his sons, his daughters, his oxen, his donkeys, his sheep, his tent, and all that belonged to him, and they brought them up to the valley of Achor. And inquiring minds want to know, where's the valley of Achor? Well, those of us that enjoy geography want to know. The rest of you, well, you'll bear with us just for a moment, right? I have a map. We don't know with absolute certainty, but best guess, okay, I know the print on there is tiny. I kind of figured you've seen this so many times now that you'll recognize it right away, but I may be wrong on that. So Jericho is right up here, and Gilgal off to the east. And there's a valley down here that seems to be the best option for the valley of Achor. There's a later date site right here, Hyrcania, which was a fortress built by the Hasmoneans and later adopted by Herod the Great. And some of my upcoming photos are from Hyrcania. There's not an X that marks the spot. I'm sorry, Daniel. There would eventually be a pile of stones, but there's a lot of piles of stones out there. So this entire region is just barren. In fact, that fortress I told you about, Hyrcania, they had to build a miles-long aqueduct to get water to it in order to have an outpost there. Otherwise, nobody could live there. But I'm not going to show you the aqueduct this time. So just a couple photos of that general region. This one shows you about where that valley is, what it looks like. One drawback of placing it here is that it's actually a fair distance from Jericho or Gilgal. This is close to 9 miles away, which I'm not quite sure what to do with that. In some ways it seems unnecessary to go that far. On another hand, perhaps they wanted this far away from themselves. I don't know. But I haven't run across any better suggestions for where this valley was. So that's all you get from me. Okay. Verse 25, Joshua said, "Why have you troubled us? The Lord will trouble you this day." And all Israel stoned them with stones, and they burned them with fire after they had stoned them with stones. That's a pretty strong punishment, it seems to me. On another hand, his violation against God was really flagrant. I mean, to be told at the start of the week, this place is dedicated to God. You don't get anything from it. It all belongs to him. And to just completely ignore that and walk in and take what you want, it's really, really flagrant sin. And I think probably those two things are tied together.
Why do you think sons and daughters?
Mm-hmm. Specifically says sons and daughters. You noticed it didn't say anything about his wife. It doesn't tell us what age his sons and daughters were. Theoretically, they could have been quite young. That would seem a bit odd to me, that God would have them killed for their father's sin. In fact, Gary, we've read some other places recently that specifically tell us in Ezekiel that God does not kill children on account of the sins of their parents. That's not his. In fact, that also reminds me of God's statement that he takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked. That's not something he enjoys. Perhaps they were grown-up children or old enough to have done something different or done something about this. I kind of am of the opinion that they were colluders. Even though Achan himself got fingered by God, he's the guy. I think the other folks in the tent were in on it too. And my opinion, that's probably the best reason for why it is that they lost their lives as well. So if we do the math just for a second, if my recollection is right, everybody older than 20 died? 17? Oh, except for 2. Yes, thank you, John. He's right. And yeah, you add 40 years onto that. Potentially, he could be 60. Could have kids that are in their 40s. Yeah, not to say everybody did, but it wouldn't be unexpected. So there's no reference to grandkids or something like that, so they were still in the house, if you will, in the tent. Yeah, it could have been to set an example. I do think it definitely sets an example, but I don't think it's purely for that either. Probably a combination. I think the punishment fits the crime, and yes, you would hope it would have an impact on the rest of the nation as well. So, yeah. The animals probably weren't in on it. Backing up the wagon. Tie a little silver under each sheep to get them out. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh.
And they've been under God's protection, his provision, his food, their clothes isn't wearing out. They're going into the nation, and he says, I'm going to take care of you, but this first city is mine. First fruits offering is mine. And then I think forward into the church, and one of the first recorded things we have happening in the church is Ananias and Sapphira,
Mm-hmm.
and how all people, because of that, feared God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. For those of you online, Pastor Gary suggested a connection with Ananias and Sapphira. in the early stages of the church, and here we are at the early stages of the nation of Israel, and maybe some extra example setting to set the tone. Because otherwise, and maybe Achan did make this mistake, thinking of God as Santa Claus. He brings me presents, and then I do what I want. And God is saying, that's not who I am. I am holy. I am righteous. I do what is good and right, and I expect you to do that too as my people. Yeah, he and he alone. It is interesting, isn't it? The method that God uses here. I think back to like the sons of Korah. Everybody stand back, and the earth splits open, and in they go. I mean, it was completely God's action. But here, he requires the Israelites to carry out the punishment on Achan. And I think that too kind of sets a precedent for later times. Mm-hmm.
Hey, Kris. Thinking as I read this, that God had given them that day, the one day beforehand, evaluate yourselves, consecrate yourselves. Here's an opportunity to come forward.
Yeah.
And as a parent, if you know that your kid did something wrong, you're waiting for that child to come forward. And, I know what you did. I'm waiting for you to confess.
Yeah.
The punishment is a little bit less severe if you come and ask for mercy. But it seems like Achan was just, he knew what was, all right, tomorrow is judgment. I'm going to continue and hide and hope. Why continue to hide?
Yeah. In fact, I have wondered before what would have happened had he confessed on his own earlier. We know that God, by nature, is gracious and kind and forgiving and long-suffering. I suspect things would have turned out differently, but he didn't. Achan did not confess on his own, only when Joshua pointed at him and said, "Tell us what you did." Cough it up. Yeah. You think he was sweating? Oh, man. Maybe he thought what I took wasn't that much. There's probably somebody else that took a lot more. Maybe they'll get, I don't know. I'm not going to really spend any time on the stoning aspect of this. David Howard, a New American Commentary, says, because Achan had violated God's command concerning the booty from Jericho, Achan found himself in the position of the inhabitants of Jericho. He himself was devoted to destruction. He, in effect, had become a Canaanite by his actions. So essentially suffered the same fate as the inhabitants of Jericho had before him. Which brings me to comparison between Rahab and Achan. This is not something I invented. It's borrowed, but I thought it was correct and worthwhile sharing with you because there is such a contrast, and I think it's intended by the author of the book of Joshua. He wants us to see this contrast. It is on the back of your handout, by the way, but if I just run through it quickly. Rahab's a woman, Achan's a man. She's a Canaanite, he's a Hebrew, and in fact of the tribe of Judah, no less. She was a prostitute, whereas he was apparently a respectable man. She should have died, but prospered. Achan should have prospered, but died. Her family and all that she owned survived, whereas his family and all that he owned perished. Her nation perished, but his nation prospered. She hid the spies from the king, and Achan hid the loot from God and from Joshua. She hid the spies on the roof, and he hid the loot under his tent. Is that significant? I don't know, but it's an interesting contrast. She feared the God of Israel, and he did not fear the God of Israel. She had only heard of what God had done for the Israelites, but believed. He had seen the acts of God, but disobeyed. He had watched as the Jordan River dried up during flood season for them to cross over. He watched the walls of Jericho fall down. He'd seen this stuff. It's miraculous stuff. And yet he still disobeyed. She'd only heard about it. Her house survived while the city was burned, whereas his tent and all that he had was burned. The cattle and sheep and donkeys of Jericho perished. The cattle and sheep and donkeys of Achan also perished. She became like an Israelite and lived. He became like a Canaanite and died. What's the point? One major point I would take from this contrast is that God is not blind when it comes to individuals. He doesn't say, oh, you're an Israelite? Oh, you're a Baptist? Oh, you were born in a Christian nation? Okay, you're good. Or the other way around. He doesn't say, oh, you're from an Islamic country? You're from a family that wasn't in the faith, or all those kinds of things. Instead, God operates on an individual basis with individual people. Even back in this day, we emphasize that in modern evangelical Christianity. You need to make a personal commitment, and that's very true, but it's also not new. I think we see it here. An Israelite who should have been a man of faith and was not, and suffered, died because of that. What do you know? A Canaanite who actually believes in God? God smiles on that. He's pleased with that, and he shows mercy and forgiveness to her. A few points to ponder here if you want to fill out the lines on your handout. There's nothing hidden from God's sight. The author of Hebrews tells us that very clearly. In Hebrews 4:13, everything is open and laid bare before the eyes of him with whom we have to do. God is not befuddled when you hide something in the ground under your tent. The rest of the nation may not know about it. It's not hidden from God. Second point, God's faithful to help us, but he cannot bless sin. And I think it's appropriate to ask yourself this question on an individual basis. Do I have sin in my life? We all sin from time to time. Have you dealt with it? Have you gone to God and asked him for forgiveness? Because he's very gracious, and he will forgive. Praise the Lord. But we need to ask, too. Don't continue covering it up and hiding it and thinking, not a big deal. God cannot and will not bless that. I'm reminded of the case of Saul. God chose him to be the king. And eventually, Saul rebelled against God, and you see this over and over again in the kings of Israel and Judah. You turn your back on God, it's not going to go well. He can't bless sin and rebellion, that kind of stuff. And we see that here. Third point, God honors those who have faith in him regardless of externals. And I'm thinking here specifically of Rahab, Achan's counterpart. You wouldn't have thought a prostitute living in Canaanite Jericho would have faith in God, but she did. And James tells us, the book of James, that it was by faith that she helped out the spies from Israel. And of course we saw that earlier in this book too, her expression of faith. And the last point here, God rejects those who rebel against him regardless of externals. God deals with us on an individual basis according to what we do. So don't be mistaken and think, I'm in the right country, I'm in the right church, I'm in the right family, so I'm good. That's not how it works. God deals with us individually. And just like he honors those who have faith in him, he rejects those who rebel against him. Any questions? I see that hand. Mm-hmm. Was it individual as opposed to large scale because of like where they're at in their history? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've kind of wondered a similar question myself. We certainly see lots of examples later on in Israelite history where kings, in particular, because they're leaders, go off and worship false gods and sacrifice their children to false gods and do all kinds of horrible things, and they're not taken out and stoned like this. Why is that? Well, that's a tough question. One of the things I keep coming back to is the fact that this was such a flagrant crime immediately following on the heels of a direct command. And I think, yeah, there is a component of God wanting to set an example there, set the tone for following days and years. But I also think this really was a very flagrant crime, and it was directly against God, who had claimed this stuff as his own. This is dedicated to me. It's the first fruits of this conquest. It's mine. And Achan said, "Oh yeah, I think I'll take a little." And it's to me, it's a little hard to imagine a more flagrant, in-your-face kind of crime against God. But it's a tough question, and yeah, you may very well be right that this does kind of set the tone at this point, because there was sin in the camp prior to this too, of various kinds. Otherwise, why would Joshua say, "Consecrate yourselves"? He said that before they even crossed the Jordan River, and here he says it again. Good. I got to quit. Next week, we'll look at the actual conquest of Ai. I've had a ball prepping it, as Gary knows, just because there's a number of geographical things in there, and you can look at a satellite photo of this area and see exactly how it plays out. And there's some fun lessons in there as well. So I'm looking forward to it, whether you guys are or not. It's kind of down my alley. Let me close this in a word of prayer. Lord, thanks you for your graciousness and kindness. We know that you are long-suffering. We also know that you are righteous and holy, and do not put up with sin forever. Help us, each and every one of us, to be quick to confess our sin, leaning on your forgiveness and your kindness to us. Help us to take these lessons to heart. Help us to be true Israelites and not just followers of you in name only, but from the heart. Ask for your blessing now on the service to come as well, and pray that you would be pleased with our praise of you and the teaching from your word. In your name I pray. Amen.